This is the longest budget in Canadian history. As Andrew Coyne pointed out in the Globe and Mail, this budget comes in at 739 pages and 232,903 words. Paul Martin's landmark budget of 1995 was fewer than 200 pages. Michael Wilson's budgets of the late 1980s that put Canada back on fiscal track and operational surpluses averaged less than 120 pages. But the longest budget in Canadian history is the biggest disappointment. Never has a budget proposed so little with so many words. There is no plan to tackle the immediate problem Canadians are facing, a lack of vaccines. There can be no economic recovery without vaccines. In Halton Region, for example, in which part of my riding is, only half the people that could have been vaccinated have been. Why? Because the federal government has failed to secure vaccines. Last month, in places like Burlington, Oakville, Milton, Georgetown, and Acton, Halton Region was only able to vaccinate 90,000 residents. They could have vaccinated 216,000 residents, or 7,200 residents a day, more than double the number of people they actually vaccinated. The reason only half the number of people were vaccinated was because of a lack of vaccines. I'll quote Halton Region directly. Quote, while we have the capacity to book approximately 7,200 appointments per day through our clinics, the availability of consistent vaccine supply continues to constrain the vaccination program rollout, end quote. But the budget does nothing. Mais le budget ne fait rien.
But the budget does nothing to fix this lack of vaccines. As a result, we are in a third wave, unlike countries that were able to ensure that they had sufficient vaccines available, such as the UK and the US.
Has no plan to build back better. It has no plan to create jobs and growth. Instead, it leaves us with a bigger debt, bigger deficits, and an avalanche of unfocused spending. The budget has no plan for regulatory and tax reform to help us in a fiercely competitive global economy. No plans to address Canada's chronically low levels of productivity, the only long-term determinant of prosperity. No plan for Canada's natural resource sector, so important as the race for critical minerals for the energy transition heats up. No plan to address the overheated housing market that has put the dream of affordable homeownership out of the reach of millions of Canadian families and saddled them with sky-high levels of indebtedness. No plan to achieve budget balance and rein in the skyrocketing debt and deficits that are threatening our children's future. Madam Speaker, don't take it from me, but take it from the experts. Here's what David Dodge, the Deputy Minister of Finance during the Chrétien government of the 1990s and former Governor of the Bank of Canada, had to say about the budget. He said in the Globe, and I quote, "My policy criticism of the budget is that it really does not focus on growth," end quote. Referring to growth and the finance minister, he continued, quote, "Over the longer haul, we face a very real challenge, and I don't think she tried seriously to address that in the budget." He went on to say that the vast majority of the extra $100 billion in spending is consumption, not investment. He also said the budget does not have a prudent fiscal plan, and I quote, "To me, it wouldn't accord with something that is a reasonably prudent fiscal plan. Let me put it that way," end quote. Madam Speaker, according to the International Monetary Fund, Canada has incurred the largest deficit amongst major economies in the last year at 20% of our GDP. Yet the IMF estimates that compared to our economic peers, Canada's economy has contracted more and will recover more slowly. Despite this, the budget does nothing to create jobs and growth. Le budget n'a pas de plan.
The budget doesn't have a plan to return to balance. The budget itself points out that in the next 5 short years alone, interest charges on the national debt will double from about $20 billion a year to about $40 billion per year.
Other experts have also been critical of the budget, as my colleague just said in his most recent remarks in the House. Here's what the former policy and budget director to this government's finance minister, Robert Asselin, had to say about the budget in The Hub. He said, quote, "The federal budget has no answers on the question of growth," end quote. He went on to say, quote, "It was clear for some time that the government's decision to spend more than $100 billion in so-called short-term stimulus was a political solution in search of an economic problem," end quote. And he concludes by saying this, quote, "After doubling our federal debt in only 6 years and spending close to $1 trillion, not moving the needle on long-term growth would be the worst possible legacy of this budget." Madam Speaker, this budget has no plan for growth, no plan to make Canada more competitive on the global stage, no plan to deal with Canada's aging labor force and chronically low levels of business investment. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has noted that a significant amount of the spending in the budget will not stimulate jobs nor create economic growth. Like many others, he has concluded that a good portion of the spending isn't stimulus at all. Much of the spending in the budget is designed to help get Liberals reelected. It's clearly a pre-election budget with a shotgun approach to spending. For example, the budget promises a national childcare program. Don't mind the fact that it's provincial jurisdiction and that some provinces have already set up universal childcare programs. Don't mind the fact that the Social Union Framework Agreement negotiated in 1999 by a previous Liberal government requires this government to get the support of the majority of provincial governments to proceed. Don't mind the fact that provinces are rightfully skeptical about a federal government setting up new shared cost programs in provincial areas of jurisdiction only to have the federal government reduce funding at a later date, leaving the provinces on the hook to make up the deficit. Madam Speaker, this promise of a national child care program is one Canadians have every right to be skeptical about. The Liberals first made this promise in the infamous Red Book of 1993, some 28 years ago. Over the last 28 years, they keep trotting it out and they keep failing to deliver. Madam Speaker, this government had 2 years to prepare for this budget. The fact that after 2 years, all they could come up with is a budget soaring in rhetoric but lacking in substance is not surprising. This is a government of an unprecedented gap between its rhetoric and reality. A government said that it was about gender equality, yet forced out of its cabinet and its caucus the first Indigenous female Minister of Justice. Forced out of its caucus, Jane Philpott, someone whose medical expertise we could have desperately used as Minister of Health during the last year of this pandemic. A government that said it was feminist, yet ignored the specific allegation of sexual harassment against the head of the armed forces. A government that said it would introduce electoral reform. A government headed by a prime minister who arrogantly proclaimed to the world in 2015 that Canada was back, and who made it a centerpiece of his foreign policy to secure a seat for Canada on the UN Security Council, but one where Canada lost the vote for this Security Council seat with 6 fewer votes than it received a decade earlier. A government that came to office promising to do more for the world's poor, but that has spent 10% less on official development assistance than the previous government. A government that came to office promising to do better on climate change, but one where emissions have risen each and every year it has been in office. In 2016, the first full year this government was in office, emissions were 708 megatons. Just last month, the government announced emissions for the latest year, 2019, at 730 megatons, a 22 megaton increase from its first full year in office when it stood at 708 megatons. And so too, Madam Speaker, it is with this budget. This is a government that says that it is focused on the middle class, that says that it's focused on jobs and growth, focused on fiscal prudence, yet it presents a budget that is focused on anything but. For all those reasons, Madam Speaker, I cannot support this budget.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And for starters, I just want to wish, we're both half Dutch heritage. I want to wish this member a happy Dutch Heritage Day. I know that we both spoke passionately in favor of Motion 207 just over a year ago, a couple of years ago, which established Dutch Heritage Day. Perhaps our only regret is that as being Dutch, we're too modest to insist on a whole month and only got one day. But anyways, I just, I want to go back to the member's comment about the vaccines, and he referenced the Halton region. I think it's fair to be critical and to assess the job of vaccine delivery. Yes, there were a couple weeks in February where there was some disruptions to the delivery, but by the end of the first quarter, we had more vaccines delivered to Canada than that had been scheduled. And more importantly, the provinces knew what the schedule was well in advance. And the provinces were also getting forecasts with respect to where the pandemic was going and what to expect. So would the member at least not agree that, yes, there may have been some disruptions, but the vaccines did get delivered as per the schedule that the provinces were expecting?
The Honourable Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and happy Dutch Heritage Day to my colleague across the aisle as well. I appreciate that sentiment. Let me respond to his question by saying this. Canada has done nothing well in response to this pandemic. It's clear that both the United States and the United Kingdom botched the early response to the pandemic a year ago. That's clear. Their cases skyrocketed. They had many more cases than we did, but they eventually pulled up their bootstraps, and they have led the world, not just the free world, they have led the world in vaccination.